There's a moment in the collapse of any nation when the symbols of sovereignty become more valuable than the sovereignty itself. For Venezuela, that moment arrived on the tarmac. Between 2018 and 2019, unmarked aircraft departed from Simon Bolivar International Airport in Caracas, bound for Istanbul. The cargo manifests were vague, the passenger lists were classified, but the weight distributions told the real story. Each plane carried between 15 and 20 tons of gold bars national reserves that represented the last liquid wealth of a dying petrostate. By the time international observers began asking questions, approximately 73 tons of Venezuelan gold had vanished into the Turkish financial system. At market prices, this represented roughly $3 billion, but the number misses the point entirely. This wasn't a heist, it was architecture. To understand what happened to Venezuela's gold, you have to abandon the framework of theft and think instead about systems under existential pressure. When a modern state begins to fail, it doesn't simply stop functioning, it transforms. And what Venezuela built in those desperate years wasn't chaos, it was a black market state, operating with the precision of any bureaucracy, just beyond the reach of international law. The question isn't why they did it. The question is, why did this particular method become inevitable? Begin with the problem Nicolas Maduro faced in late 2017. His government had inherited an economy built entirely on oil revenue, and oil prices had collapsed. Hyperinflation was accelerating past 1,000,000% annually. The national currency, the bolivar, had become a unit of measurement, so abstract that citizens stopped counting and started weighing cash. International sanctions prevented Venezuela from accessing the global financial system. The government couldn't borrow, it couldn't trade. Normally, it couldn't even maintain correspondent banking relationships. But governments still need to pay for things: salaries for security forces, imports of essential goods, bribes to maintain coalition loyalty. The machinery of power requires liquidity, and Venezuela had run out of all conventional sources, except one. Deep in the vaults of the Central Bank of Venezuela sat approximately 150 tons of gold-accumulated reserves from earlier decades when the state still functioned. This gold represented something remarkable: an asset with no counterparty risk, no dependence on international banking infrastructure, and complete fungibility across jurisdictions. In a world where Venezuela's bank accounts were frozen and its oil shipments were sanctioned, gold could still move. The problem was converting it into usable currency without triggering international legal mechanisms. This is where Turkey enters the story, and the partnership reveals something essential about modern geopolitics. Turkey in 2018 was experiencing its own currency crisis. The lira was plummeting. Foreign reserves were depleting. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan needed hard assets to stabilize the central bank's balance sheet and to maintain import capacity. Conventional allies were scarce. Western sanctions over Syria and other conflicts had strained traditional relationships. What Turkey offered Venezuela was elegant: a jurisdiction willing to accept gold shipments without scrutinizing their provenance too carefully. With the infrastructure to refine and remarket the metal into the global supply chain, and with the geopolitical positioning to resist American pressure for compliance, what Venezuela offered Turkey was equally valuable: tons of physical gold at rates slightly below market price, providing instant balance sheet improvement and hard currency generation. This wasn't exploitation. It was arbitrage between two states operating outside the traditional financial system, each solving the other's liquidity crisis. The flights themselves followed a pattern. Venezuelan military transports or chartered cargo aircraft would load the gold typically in standard 400-ounce bars bearing the stamps of Venezuelan refineries. Security was managed by officials from Smuggling, Venezuela's intelligence service, and senior military officers with direct loyalty to Maduro. The planes would refuel in Cape Verde or other African waypoints, where oversight was minimal. Upon landing in Istanbul, the gold would transfer directly to Turkish government custody or to private refineries with close state connections. From there, the metal would be refined, recast, and reissued with Turkish hallmarks, effectively laundering its origin. Some gold entered the Turkish central bank's reserves. Some flowed to jewelry manufacturers in the Grand Bazaar. Much of it continued onward to Dubai, where the gold trade operates with even fewer questions. Or to Switzerland, where refineries have long specialized in transforming questionable sourcing into respectable bullion. In exchange, Venezuela received cash payments, often in euros or dollars, deposited into accounts held by shell companies in third countries. These funds would then cycle back through additional corporate structures before reaching regime-controlled entities. The money financed everything from food imports to weapons purchases to the offshore accounts that serve as exile insurance for the ruling elite. This mechanism, gold for liquidity, opacity for protection, became the central operating principle of the Venezuelan state during its most acute crisis period. But here's what standard corruption narratives miss. This system wasn't a deviation from governance, it became governance itself. Consider the institutional transformation required to execute this operation. The Central Bank of Venezuela had to be subordinated completely to executive control, with any remaining technocratic independence eliminated. Military logistics networks had to be repurposed for commercial trafficking. Intelligence services had to manage security for what was essentially a smuggling operation. Diplomatic cover had to be maintained through allied nations. Legal frameworks had to be constructed to provide thin justifications for reserve drawdowns. This wasn't officials stealing from the state. This was the state reorganizing itself around extraction and capital flight as its primary function. The economic literature has a term for this, the resource curse. But Venezuela's experience suggests a more specific phenomenon, the terminal stage of petrostate dysfunction, where the entire governmental apparatus pivots from production and distribution to pure extraction and conversion. The state stops trying to generate wealth and focuses exclusively on monetizing whatever wealth remains, then moving that value beyond the reach of both domestic populations and international creditors. What makes this architecture sustainable, even temporarily, is its distributed benefit structure. The gold operation required cooperation from hundreds of individuals across multiple institutions. Each participant became complicit and therefore invested in the system's survival. Military officers received payment. Intelligence officials secured their own offshore positions. Central bank employees were rotated frequently enough to prevent whistleblowing coalitions. Even lower-level functionaries benefited from the parallel economy that the operation enabled. This creates a political economy where institutional loyalty is purchased through shared criminality rather than through ideological commitment or legal obligation. It's remarkably stable precisely because everyone has something to lose from the system's exposure. The psychology here matters deeply. When we think about corruption, we typically imagine individuals making discrete choices to violate norms for personal gain. But what happens when the entire institutional environment shifts such that following official procedures would be irrational, even suicidal for one's career and safety? Consider a mid-level official at the Central Bank of Venezuela in 2018. The official rules say gold. Reserves should only be sold through transparent auctions with documented pricing and parliamentary oversight. But parliament has been dissolved. The currency is worthless. Your colleagues who objected to irregular transactions have been reassigned or arrested. Your family's survival depends on access to dollars that only come through participation in the informal system. The choice isn't between corruption and integrity. It's between participating in the only functional system that exists or accepting professional and possibly physical elimination. This is how institutions hollow out, not through sudden coups or dramatic betrayals, but through the gradual realization among everyone involved that the official rules have become fictional, that survival requires operating according to unwritten protocols, and that the only career path involves deeper complicity. The gold flights became possible because hundreds of people made this calculation simultaneously and arrived at the same conclusion. The system persisted because defection became psychologically and practically impossible once you were inside it. Now consider the Turkish side of this equation more carefully. The standard analysis treats Turkey as an opportunistic middleman, profiting from Venezuela's desperation, but Turkey's own economic fragility made this relationship nearly as essential for Ankara as it was for Caracas. Between 2018 and 2020, Turkey faced a severe currency crisis driven by inflation, political uncertainty, and strained relationships with traditional allies. The central bank's foreign reserves were depleting rapidly. The government needed hard assets to defend the lira and maintain import capacity. But Turkey's geopolitical isolation sanctions, pressure from the United States over Syria, the S-400 missile purchase from Russia, and tensions with the European Union limited access to conventional financial support. Venezuelan gold provided an immediate solution. Each shipment improved Turkey's reserve position. The gold could be used as collateral for currency swaps with other nations, or refined and sold for hard currency, or held as a balance sheet asset. And because the transactions occurred between central banks or state-connected entities, they carried a veneer of legitimacy that purely private smuggling would lack. Turkey also benefited from the refinement and remarketing margins. Turkish refineries became keynotes in washing Venezuelan gold into the legitimate global supply chain. The metal would arrive with Venezuelan hallmarks, be melted and recast with Turkish certifications, and enter international markets without the stigma of its origin. This value-added processing generated fees, employment, and economic activity within Turkey's gold sector. The refineries themselves deserve closer examination. Gold refining is a technically sophisticated process, but it's also one that inherently obscures origin. When you melt down a bar stamped with Venezuelan insignia and recast it with a Turkish hallmark, you've not just changed the appearance, you've broken the chain of custody. The new bar is chemically identical to the old one, but documentarily it's a Turkish product. This transformation is worth a premium because it converts politically toxic assets into neutral commodities. Switzerland's role in this chain is particularly instructive. Swiss refineries process roughly 70% of the world's gold, and they've developed elaborate systems for maintaining plausible deniability about sourcing. The official standards require documentation, but the reality is that once gold has been refined once, say, in Turkey and issued a new certificate, Swiss refineries can accept it as a legitimate Turkish product without investigating further back in the chain. This creates a laundering cascade. Venezuelan gold becomes Turkish gold, becomes Swiss gold, becomes anonymous gold in the London bullion market. At each stage, the documentation becomes slightly more respectable. The questions become slightly less pointed, until the original sin of the extraction is completely obscured. The system works because everyone involved has an incentive not to look too closely. Turkish refineries profit from the processing. Swiss refineries profit from the volume, and buyers, in Dubai or elsewhere, get gold slightly below market rate and don't want to know why. The incentive structure rewards opacity at every node. More subtly, the relationship with Venezuela provided Turkey with geopolitical leverage. By serving as a sanctions evasion hub, Turkey positioned itself as an essential partner for other states under international pressure, Iran, Russia, and others exploring alternatives to dollar-dominated finance. This wasn't just about one bilateral relationship, it was about building infrastructure for a parallel international economic system. Turkey's willingness to absorb reputational risk and regulatory pressure from Western allies in exchange for hard assets and geopolitical positioning represents a calculated bet that the future of international economics involves multiple competing systems rather than one dominant framework, and that being a crucial node in the alternative network is worth more than marginal integration into the traditional one. This calculation has proven largely correct. Despite American displeasure, despite European criticism, Turkey has maintained its role as a conduit for sanctioned regimes while also remaining formally within NATO and connected to Western markets. It's a delicate balance, but it's been sustainable precisely because Turkey provides services that other states need and cannot easily obtain elsewhere. The architecture here reveals something important about modern sanctions regimes. Economic isolation is supposed to compel behavioral change by denying states access to resources. But when multiple sanctioned or semi-sanctioned states cooperate, they can create alternative networks that are less efficient than the mainstream system, but sufficient for regime survival. Venezuela and Turkey weren't outliers. They were pioneers in sanctions-resistant economic design. The question becomes, why doesn't this system collapse under its own inefficiency? Traditional economic theory suggests that black markets are costly. They require secrecy, which adds transaction costs. They limit the pool of potential trading partners. They prevent access to legal enforcement mechanisms. They generate principal-agent problems because every transaction involves counterparties who might betray you. Over time, these inefficiencies should make shadow economies uncompetitive, forcing participants back toward legitimate commerce. But this assumes the goal is economic optimization. For the Maduro regime, the goal was political survival. And for that purpose, inefficiency is acceptably. Preferably if it maintains control, the the gold operation generated less revenue than transparent reserve management would have. The discounts offered to Turkey, the fees paid to intermediaries, the costs of secrecy, the risk premiums demanded by every participant, all of these reduced net returns. A transparent auction of Venezuelan gold reserves through the London bullion market would have generated perhaps 20 to 30% more revenue. But transparent reserve management would have subjected those assets to international legal claims, creditor seizures, and sanctions enforcement. The inefficiency was the price of keeping the money out of reach. Moreover, the opacity of the system provided political advantages. Without clear accounting, it became impossible for domestic opposition or international observers to track exactly how much wealth was extracted or where it went. This informational asymmetry protected the regime from accountability and prevented coordination. Among potential challengers, if the opposition could prove that exactly X tons of gold were sold for exactly Y million dollars, and only Z million reached the government budget, the gap would become a political weapon. But when the entire operation is cloaked in secrecy, you can't even formulate the accusation precisely. You know theft occurred, but you can't quantify it, which makes it harder to mobilize outrage or legal action. The system was designed not for prosperity but for extraction without oversight, and by that measure, it succeeded completely. There's also a temporal element worth considering. Maduro's government has operated with an expectation of eventual collapse or forced exit. Since at least 2015, every policy decision has been made with the assumption that the regime might need to flee into exile within months or years. Under those conditions, maximizing long-term economic growth is irrational. What matters is converting as much national wealth as possible into portable, protected personal assets before the inevitable end. The gold flights make perfect sense in this framework. They transformed illiquid national reserves into liquid offshore accounts. They created relationships with foreign governments that might provide exile sanctuary. They distributed enough benefits to key supporters to maintain loyalty during the endgame. This isn't governance, it's organized extraction with a clear time horizon. But then something unexpected happened. The collapse didn't come. The regime survived 2019, then 2020, then 2021. International pressure continued, but didn't intensify sufficiently to force regime change. The opposition fragmented. The population, already devastated, had no capacity for sustained mobilization. And the shadow economy infrastructure that was built for short-term survival became the long-term operating system. This is the accidental permanence of temporary measures. The gold flights and the broader black market state architecture were never meant to be sustainable. They were meant to buy time. But buying enough time transforms the temporary into the structural. But the gold flights were only one component of a much larger transformation. While international attention focused on the dramatic imagery of bullion disappearing into the sky, the Venezuelan economy was undergoing a more fundamental restructuring at every level of society. By 2019, the formal economy had contracted by roughly 65% from its 2013 peak. This isn't just a recession, it's a civilizational collapse in economic terms. Hyperinflation had destroyed the currency's utility for most transactions. At the peak, prices were doubling every 19 days. The bolivar became useful primarily as a unit for measuring absurdity rather than value. State institutions continued to exist on paper, but had ceased to function in practice. Hospitals operated without medicine or electricity. Schools opened sporadically and without supplies. Courts issued rulings that no one enforced. Police officers supplemented their worthless salaries through extortion. Teachers left the profession entirely. The apparatus of the state became a theatrical performance, maintained for legitimacy purposes, but disconnected from any actual service delivery. Food distribution systems had collapsed. The government's CLAP program, nominally providing subsidized food boxes to poor families, became a tool of political control and corruption. Boxes arrived irregularly, contained spoiled or inappropriate items, and required political loyalty to access. The system was designed to create dependence rather than to solve hunger. Healthcare infrastructure had failed so completely that diseases long controlled through vaccination, measles, diphtheria, malariae, turned in epidemic proportions. Maternal mortality spiked. Infant mortality reversed decades of progress. People died from treatable conditions because antibiotics were unavailable or unaffordable. Electricity grids operated sporadically, with blackouts lasting days or weeks in some regions. The collapse of power infrastructure was both cause and effect of the broader breakdown. Maintenance required parts and expertise that required functional currency and supply chains, but the absence of reliable power made it impossible to sustain the economy that might generate those resources. In response, Venezuelans built a parallel economy that operated on entirely different principles than the official one. This wasn't resistance or revolution, it was adaptation. When the official currency became worthless, people shifted to dollars, cryptocurrency, and barter. Physical dollars became the primary store of value and medium of exchange for any significant transaction. People who had never heard of Bitcoin became users of cryptocurrency wallets because it was the only way to receive remittances from family abroad or to transact with people in other cities. When formal supply chains broke, informal networks emerged. Smuggling routes from Colombia became the primary source for consumer goods. Black market distribution hubs appeared in border towns, moving everything from food to fuel to medicine. Neighborhood cooperatives pooled resources, organizing collective purchases from smugglers to get bulk discounts. When legal employment disappeared, people created their own work in the informal sector. Street vending exploded. Services became increasingly personalized and cash-based. The distinction between legal and illegal work became meaningless when there was no enforcement mechanism and no legal economy providing alternatives. The psychological shift is crucial and often overlooked in discussions of economic collapse. In a functioning state, most people internalize the assumption that institutions will continue operating, that money will hold value, that laws will be enforced, that services will be provided, that contracts will be honored. These assumptions are so fundamental that we rarely articulate them. They're the background operating system of normal economic life. When those assumptions prove false, individuals undergo a profound cognitive restructuring. The illegal becomes normal because legality has no enforcement. The informal becomes primary because formal systems have stopped functioning. Trust shifts from institutions to personal networks, because institutions have demonstrated themselves to be unreliable. This isn't a moral change, it's not that Venezuelans became less ethical or more criminal. It's an epistemological change in what they believe to be true about how the world works. If you believe the bank will protect your savings, you deposit money. If you've watched banks freeze accounts and inflation destroy deposits, you hide cash. If you believe police will protect you, you call them. If you've watched police participate in extortion, you arm yourself or hire private security. Venezuela didn't just experience economic collapse. It experienced the mass dissolution of the cognitive framework that treats the state as the legitimate center of economic and social life. And here's the uncomfortable realization that connects the elite behavior to the popular experience. The regime's shadow economy and the population's survival economy operated on identical logical principles. Both relied on opacity over transparency. Both depended on informal networks rather than official institutions. Both treated formal rules as facades. Both prioritized immediate liquidity over long-term sustainability. Both involved sanctions evasion, the government evading international sanctions, individuals evading what little domestic regulation remained. The Maduro government was selling national gold reserves through covert flights to Turkey. Ordinary Venezuelans were selling household possessions through black market channels to Colombia. The scale differed enormously, billions versus hundreds of dollars. The consequences were vastly unequal. Some people secured exile insurance, while others secured next week's food. The moral culpability was completely different. One group was looting the nation. The other was simply trying to survive. But the mechanism converting whatever assets remain into immediately usable currency through extra-legal channels beyond state oversight was identical at every level of Venezuelan society. This creates a strange and troubling congruence. The regime wasn't imposing an alien system on an unwilling population. It was operating according to the same survival logic that every Venezuelan had adopted. The government and the governed were both participants in the same shadow economy, just at vastly different levels of the hierarchy, with vastly different resources, and with vastly different responsibilities for creating the crisis. This helps explain why the system proved so resilient to challenges, and why opposition movements struggled to gain traction. There was no clear alternative framework to rally around. The formal economy had ceased to exist. The previous institutional order had been so thoroughly discredited that returning to it wasn't even conceptually available. As an option, you can't restore something that no longer exists in any meaningful form. The choice wasn't between a functioning state and a criminal regime. It was between different positions within a comprehensively informal system. Opposition leaders promised a return to constitutional order. But constitutional order requires functioning institutions, enforceable laws, stable currency, and state capacity. None of those existed. The promise rang hollow because it required believing in the possibility of something that had become psychologically unavailable. International observers often frame this as a situation where the population is victimized by the elite. That's absolutely true in terms of resource distribution, power asymmetries, and moral responsibility for the crisis. The regime created the conditions for collapse and profited from it. The population suffered catastrophically and had no role in creating the disaster. But psychologically, both groups had made the same adaptation, accepting that the state no longer functions as advertised and building survival strategies around that recognition. The difference was that elites built those strategies with stolen billions, while ordinary people built them with whatever they could scrape together. The real devastation wasn't just material, though the material suffering was extraordinary. It was the destruction of the social contract as a believable concept. The idea that there exists a legitimate authority that will provide security, enforce rights, deliver services, and operate according to known rules. This idea requires trust in institutions, and that trust, once destroyed, cannot be simply reasserted through rhetoric or elections. Venezuela didn't just lose its economy, it lost the shared belief system that makes modern economic and political life possible. And rebuilding that is vastly more difficult than rebuilding infrastructure or even currency stability. Now extend this pattern forward and consider what Venezuela represents for the broader international system. Venezuela is not unique. It's not an aberration. It's a preview of a model that is being replicated and refined elsewhere, as the United States and its allies increasingly deploy sanctions as the primary tool of geopolitical pressure. More states will find themselves cut off from the conventional international financial system. The logic is straightforward. Economic isolation should compel behavioral change by denying regimes the resources they need to sustain themselves. But this logic assumes that there are no alternatives to the mainstream financial system, and that assumption is proving false. Some sanctioned states will capitulate under pressure. Others will collapse into failed states. But a third category will adapt by building shadow architectures similar to Venezuela's, often with help from other sanctioned or semi-sanctioned states that have developed this expertise. We're already seeing the emergence of this infrastructure across multiple countries and regions. Russia, facing comprehensive sanctions after 2022, has developed elaborate evasion networks involving cryptocurrency exchanges, commodity trades routed through Central Asian republics and other third countries, parallel payment systems that bypass SWIFT, and shell company structures spanning dozens of jurisdictions. The system is inefficient compared to normal trade, but it's functional enough to prevent economic collapse. Iran has maintained oil exports despite comprehensive sanctions for over a decade by using ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, false documentation, and flag changes, payments in gold or barter, and routing through intermediaries in Malaysia, China, and elsewhere. Iranian oil reaches global markets, despite supposedly airtight sanctions, because the incentive to evade is strong enough and the methods are available. North Korea, perhaps the most isolated economy on Earth, has financed its regime through cybercrime, including exchange hacks and ransomware counterfeiting. Of currency and consumer goods, weapons sales mediated by Chinese intermediaries, and forced labor contracts in countries like Russia and China. The state has essentially become a criminal enterprise, but it's a functional criminal enterprise that has sustained the regime for decades, despite total isolation. Each of these systems shares core structural features with Venezuela's gold operation. They all rely on physical commodities or cryptocurrency to store and transfer value without touching the monitored financial system. They all route transactions through jurisdictions with weak enforcement or political unwillingness to cooperate with sanctions. They all depend on state-to-state cooperation outside traditional alliance structures. And they all accept significant efficiency losses in exchange for sanctions resistance and regime survival. The technology supporting these systems is improving rapidly. Cryptocurrency provides increasingly sophisticated tools for moving value without banking infrastructure. Privacy coins like Monero offer anonymity that even Bitcoin lacks. Decentralized exchanges allow currency conversion without centralized choke points. Smart contracts automate complex transactions without trusted intermediaries. Satellite tracking and blockchain analysis create transparency problems for sanctions evaders. But they also drive innovation in evasion techniques. Ship-to-ship transfers happen in zones without satellite coverage. Cryptocurrency gets mixed through tumblers that obscure origin. Shell companies proliferate in jurisdictions that don't share information. The cat-and-mouse game between sanctions enforcement and sanctions evasion is producing increasingly complex architectures on both sides. What we're witnessing is the emergence of a parallel international economic system, less efficient than the mainstream, more fragmented, operating with higher transaction costs and greater risks, but functional enough to sustain authoritarian regimes that would otherwise face immediate economic collapse. This parallel system has several crucial characteristics. It's multipolar, with several hub countries like Turkey, UAE, China playing central roles rather than one dominant node. It's resilient because it's decentralized. There's no single choke point that could shut it down. It's adaptive, constantly evolving new methods as old ones get monitored or blocked. And it's growing, with more sophisticated infrastructure and more participants every year. The implications extend far beyond the sanctioned states themselves. The existence of shadow channels creates opportunities for corruption and capital flight, even in countries that aren't under sanctions. Wealthy individuals and corporations anywhere can route money through the same networks that serve sanctioned regimes. The infrastructure built for geopolitical purposes becomes available for private tax evasion, money laundering, and asset concealment. A Mexican businessman wanting to hide assets from tax authorities can use the same cryptocurrency exchanges and shell company structures that Iranian oil exporters use to evade sanctions. A Russian oligarch moving money out of the country uses the same Turkish gold dealers that Venezuela used. The techniques proliferate beyond their original purpose. This creates a perverse dynamic. The more sophisticated sanctions enforcement becomes, the more valuable the evasion infrastructure becomes, which creates stronger incentives to build and maintain it, which makes it available for non-sanctions purposes, which undermines financial transparency more broadly. The boundary between the formal and informal global economy becomes more porous and harder to defend. And as that boundary weakens, the premium on opacity increases. States and individuals with resources invest heavily in maintaining secrecy, while transparency becomes an indicator of vulnerability rather than legitimacy or good governance. We can see this shift in the behavior of countries that aren't sanctioned but are watching carefully. China has developed its own parallel payment systems like SIPs, not because it's currently sanctioned, but because it watched what happened to Russia and wants insurance against future sanctions. India maintains cryptocurrency infrastructure and alternative payment channels as hedges. Even European companies maintain subsidiary networks that could operate independently of dollar clearing if needed. The result is a fragmentation of the global financial system, not a clean split into two systems, but a gradual proliferation of parallel channels, backup networks, and alternative infrastructure. The mainstream system still dominates, but it's no longer monopolistic, and every time sanctions are deployed, the relative attractiveness of the alternatives increases. This is the uncomfortable lesson that Venezuela's gold teaches us. The shadow architecture wasn't a failure of governance. It was a successful adaptation to a specific set of constraints imposed by international pressure. It kept the regime in power when all conventional mechanisms had failed. It created a template that other states are already studying, replicating, and improving. The flights to Turkey weren't the story of a nation being robbed, though that certainly happened. They were the story of a state learning to survive by becoming a black market version of itself, maintaining the formal appearance of sovereignty while operating according to entirely different rules internally. The gold didn't disappear into chaos or mere corruption. It transformed into the operating capital of a regime that had accepted permanent informality as the price of continuation. And more importantly, it demonstrated a method that works. Not for the population, the human suffering in Venezuela has been catastrophic and continues. Not for long-term prosperity, the country's economic potential has been devastated. Not for democratic governance or human rights or social welfare or any of the values that might make a society worth living in, but for regime survival, for maintaining power, for converting national wealth into personal security, for persisting beyond the point where conventional analysis would predict collapse for those purposes. The shadow state architecture is remarkably, troublingly effective. Venezuela showed that a government can lose everything that supposedly makes a state functional. It can lose economic productivity, international legitimacy, domestic popular support, institutional capacity, and service delivery capability. It can preside over hyperinflation, mass emigration, collapsed infrastructure, and widespread suffering. And yet, it can still persist indefinitely, as long as it retains the capacity to extract and convert remaining assets through channels beyond the reach of formal accountability. As long as it maintains loyalty among security forces through distributed complicity, and as long as it can access the growing parallel international system that enables sanctions evasion, the gold flights weren't evidence of Venezuela's uniqueness or the exceptional criminality of one particular regime. They were a demonstration of a repeatable process, a proof of concept that the model works. And in a world where geopolitical competition increasingly operates through economic exclusion rather than military confrontation, where sanctions are deployed more frequently and more comprehensively, where the technological tools for building shadow systems are becoming more accessible, the shadow state model isn't an aberration. It's becoming a distinct category of governance with its own logic and sustainability. The question for the international system isn't whether this architecture is morally acceptably, clearly isn't. The question isn't even whether it's economically sustainable in the traditional sense. It obviously isn't optimal. The question is how many other states will build versions of it as sanctions pressure increases, and what the global economic and political order looks like when the shadow infrastructure becomes as significant as the formal one. We're already past the early stages. The infrastructure exists. The expertise has been developed, the template has been proven. The network of states willing to participate has formed and is expanding. The technological tools are improving. The incentives are clear. Venezuela didn't fail to become a normal state. It succeeded in becoming a new kind of state, one designed from the foundation to operate beyond the framework that defines normalcy, that sustains itself through extraction and opacity rather than production and transparency, that treats international isolation not as a death sentence but as a design constraint to be engineered around. The gold vanished from Venezuelan vaults, yes, but it didn't disappear into chaos or into simple theft. It disappeared into a system, a functioning architecture with multiple nodes and participants and standardized procedures, one that works precisely because it refuses to be fully visible, that operates in the gaps and shadows of the international order, that turns the weakness of isolation into a perverse kind of strength. And that system is still running, still evolving, still spreading. This is what we've learned. You can sanction a regime, but you cannot sanction it into simplicity. The response to pressure isn't collapsed, transformation into something harder to reach, harder to monitor, harder to stop. Venezuela's gold didn't vanish. It just changed forms, moving from the visible to the invisible economy, from official reserves to shadow channels, from a symbol of national wealth to a lubricant of authoritarian persistence. And somewhere tonight, another plane is loading in another desperate capital, bound for another willing intermediary, carrying another cargo that will disappear into the same vast machinery of the shadow state. The architecture Venezuela built doesn't belong to Venezuela anymore. It belongs to the system now, and the system is growing.